at the beginning of that period, there were MPs' lives were in danger from organized terrorism, from the IRA.
Yeah.
And Ian Gow was a good friend of mine, and he was killed by a car bomb. So it was not unusual as a member of Parliament to know colleagues who had been killed in the course of their work as a member of Parliament. Then, of course, with the end of the with peace in Northern Ireland, we went into a better period. But now we have seen 2 MPs killed, and now Ant Widdecombe, for whatever circumstances now come to light. So it has got worse.
We do want to start, as we've done a lot this morning, talking about the killing of Anne Widdecombe, how the police have behaved, and also this question of how politicians' security might actually be affected. Devon and Cornwall Police, of course, initially insisted there was nothing to suggest that the alleged murder of Anne Widdecombe had been politically motivated, but that then changed. I guess the question, Kezia, is this, that as we put it on our show this morning, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. Would it not have been better for them to say, we don't know, other information might become clear, and then as that information became clear, they could give it, rather than saying twice, as far as the evidence is available, that we didn't believe this was politically motivated, which was probably true at the time, but then having to seem to row back from it. Would you have done anything differently if you were advising the police?
It's really hard to know, right? And let's start with the obvious, which is this is absolutely horrendous set of circumstances, and I think would put the fear into all of us about what is possible and what could happen to you in your own home. I think from a comms perspective, the conversation in the police must have gone along the lines of, in a 24/7 media world, desperate desire for information at the click of a button, that it makes more sense to put as much information as you can out into the ether versus leaving a vacuum for other people to fill. So perhaps the circumstances were that there wasn't a political motivation for this until there was. And unfortunately, the police had just bound themselves up in an unnecessary process nonsense here and taken the edge off what should be a much wider conversation about how such an awful set of circumstances could happen and what we're going to do about the safety of people who have very public lives.
Well, let's get to that in a moment, because I think that's such a critical point, Kezia. But William, the other effect on this is Reform UK believed the establishment is against them. It was the basis on which Nigel Farage called that by-election in Clacton the week before, saying it's the establishment versus the people. And rightly or wrongly, Reform will now say, I told you, because the police told us one thing, and only because we complained about it and said there must be something else to see here, did they change their position. This proves the point of all they've been saying. So the police have sort of reinforced the narrative to Reform UK as well.
Well, I think that would be taking the argument much too far to say it reinforces that narrative, which isn't true anyway, by the way. There is no establishment that is gunning for Nigel Farage in terms of newspaper stories and so on. There would be just the same stories about anybody else in any other political party, and he seems to be trying to avoid scrutiny. But it's certainly not a connection with this horrendous case. As I knew Anne Widdecombe very well in the past, and she was in my shadow cabinet. Absolutely wonderful person. So I'm really very stunned and sad about the events of the last few days. The police seem to have been doing a good job in most respects. That they have arrested a suspect hundreds of miles away. They've clearly been investigating extremely thoroughly. It is surprising that they would then say, rather than just say, we're keeping a completely open mind. I do find that surprising. I think they have opened themselves to criticism on that in initially ruling out anything terror-related. But it doesn't reinforce some wider argument that is just a police officer saying what they think when it would have been better to keep their own counsel and say publicly they're keeping an open mind. It's not part of a wider argument about the establishment, I don't think, at all.
How worried are you and should we be about the dangers in public life now? There's a story in the Times about people at a trans protest where they're stabbing effigies of Andy Burnham. And every politician we've ever spoken to on this programme, I think, in the 6 years we've been doing it, has had an experience of being threatened or feeling abused primarily online, but the danger of the online culture becoming the dominant culture in our lives is that what happens online can easily take place in the real world as well. Do you worry about that?
Yeah, I think this in context, if I look back on since I became when I became a member of Parliament in 1989, and then I had 26 years, it got better and then it got worse. Because at the beginning of that period, there were MPs' lives were in danger from organised terrorism, from the IRA.
Yeah.
And Ian Gow was a good friend of mine, and he was killed by a car bomb. So it was not unusual as a member of Parliament to know colleagues who had been killed in the course of their work as a member of Parliament. Then, of course, with the end of with peace in Northern Ireland, we went into a better period. But now we have seen 2 MPs killed, and now Ant Widdecombe, in whatever circumstances now come to light. So it has got worse, and I think the source of that is I think at least what's contributing to that is the verbal violence of online debate, which is not like the civilized debate in person that we were used to before. So addressing that culture is going to be more important and more practical, actually, than trying to protect hundreds and hundreds of people, which is not a practical or desirable thing, because part of the job of a politician is to be out among people and mixing with people and going to dozens of events where you can't be heavily protected at all of them.
But that's the question, isn't it? Because it's an excellent point there that you'd rather not have to protect everyone, because there's going to be at any one time any number of ex-politicians around, and with each electoral cycle there'll be more of them. And we've had 5 prime ministers in 6 years as an example of that. But can you really pour the wine back into the bottle? Is the culture we've got the culture we're stuck with? It doesn't strike me there's anything going to change in terms of online behaviour, for example. And you only have to, I go on less and less, Kezia, but if I often look at you, someone makes a relatively anodyne post, you look underneath it, and the anger's there, but the violence is there, the malignity, the failure to recognise good faith on anyone, it just seeps into anything. I'm not sure that's fixable.
Oh, look, it's absolutely horrendous. And the last time I was in the studio with you both, I showed you a video of my wife that was on the Scottish Government website, and all of the comments and accusations and, stuff that was said below that on an official outlet of the government. This isn't Twitter or X or any other social media platform. This is writ large everywhere you look. But look, I think we need to separate the issue of what we do about the culture and what we do about social media from this issue of the security of our politicians. Because whilst I kind of understand what William's saying about, you can't provide police protection for every single member of Parliament or for every single politician, we could do an awful lot more than we are currently doing.
Oh, really? Do you think it's not good enough at the minute?
Oh my God, it's nowhere near good enough. So let me give you an example of that. When my wife was recently promoted and became the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, it was an amazing thing in our family, a wonderful achievement, something to celebrate. But the response in our family was one of deep fear and concern. They were deeply anxious and worried about her security going forward. But the reality of that is she goes most places in a car. She's rarely on her own. There's almost always someone with her. That's not the case for the vast majority of MPs that aren't in the government or in opposition. It's certainly not the case for members of the Scottish Parliament that aren't in government, and it's nowhere near the case for the thousands of people who are councillors across the country who very often go into very public places on their own, run surgeries in church halls and community centres, that are deeply exposed to people walking in off the streets and saying the most outrageous things to them, or arguably doing the most outrageous things to them. We forget, I think, that not only were 2 MPs murdered, but they were murdered in their surgeries, putting themselves in front of the public. And one of the things that's happened since that point is that our elected politicians, in the absence of security, are retreating from public spaces. So they are less likely to have shop fronts, less likely to have open surgeries in the same way. So this idea that, there's not a price to be paid for the absence of security, I think needs an awful lot more examination here. If we want open and accessible politicians, we have to give them the security to do that. The security doesn't stop them being open and accessible. It's part of the mix.
William, can I ask you, because obviously you've had high-profile jobs in frontline politics, and you've also been around the world. You will have met, leaders of countries that maybe don't necessarily agree with the UK, and there'll be people within those countries that don't necessarily, or didn't at the time, agree with you. Do you feel that you've had adequate protection subsequent to your time in frontline politics? Is that something we need to consider here?
Well, again, it would be difficult. Certainly, I had plenty of protection, adequate protection, when I was the Foreign Secretary. And actually, I don't really disagree with Kezia. She makes a very powerful point, and I'm not saying we can't do more, but I'm really saying, and would be my answer to your question, if you add together all the members of the House of Commons, the Scottish and Welsh parliaments, you're straight up to 900 people. If you do have real protection, as I did when I was Foreign Secretary, that takes about 9 or 10 police officers working in shifts around the clock. Are we really going to have the thousands and thousands of people and it does inhibit your contact with other people. So actually, I was entirely happy when after a few months after I'd stopped being Foreign Secretary, when my all that protective screen disappeared, because I was able to get on with more normal life. But then I was out of office. That's different from being Deputy First Minister of Scotland, which Kezia has just been discussing. And that's never been a problem to me. In fact, I really enjoy meeting people as I go out and about.
But then Anne Widdecombe wasn't in office anymore either.
Yes,
and that's
exactly.
Yes. But anyway, we keep coming back to the point, we don't precisely know what happened here, and we're legally required not to speculate, and we don't want to speculate. But that will be a question that needs to get answered, I suspect, as we move along, is that people who aren't even elected politicians but are associated with the political party, for example, the question gets risen as well.